Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Tomlinson Talks for Monday, the 9th of February, 2026. Let me remember if I've got the right year. I do indeed. I hope you can all see me, chat. Hello, how are you? This evening we're going to be discussing whether or not, according to accusations made by some critics on Twitter, Reform have been captured by their donors, and that is dictating their domestic and especially their foreign policy and their voter outreach strategy. We're going to be discussing a lot about Nigel Farage's recent trips to Dubai, their investment in light of the Epstein Files, their donors, and the connections they're courting in light of the Epstein Files, and Reform setting up a Friends of Israel and Jews for Reform chapters. We are going to be answering super chats throughout the broadcast and at the end of the show. And we already have two, so thank you very much, ladies and gents. We'll get these out of the way before we begin. Thank you to... I'm just trying to expand. Jack, there we go. Have you ever watched Invincible on Prime? If not, check it out, it's really good. I saw the first series, found Amber insufferable, and thought that Atom Eve's character was far superior and got less screen time, and got to the final episode, enjoyed the Omni-Man and Mark fight, and then heard that Seth Rogen was involved and was going to be showing up some more, and just dropped off. I don't actually watch very many TV shows or anything these days. I'm thinking of doing a show, I don't know if this will interest people, on discourse, burnout, the slopification of commentary, and also why, not just with the sheer poor quality of pop culture, but why I spend very little time these days on keeping up with anything new or even carving out time for my hobbies, unless my wife forces me to play some sort of game with her or something. Just because I feel like with the existential nature of politics, I can't excuse time spent on unserious things. I think it's something I'm going to have to learn again, but a lot of people have been talking about this recently. Dave Green, Aura McIntyre, Nima Parvini, and I want to draw some threads together in perhaps casual stream, so let me know if that's of interest. And he asked if I've seen a bunch of anime. I haven't. I'm not an anime fan. I read some of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and thought it was the gayest thing I'd ever seen. I read Berserk, I thought the art was excellent. I thought the Lost Children and Eclipse arcs were perverse and too far for my tastes, but I enjoyed the Golden Age. And I enjoy some Junji Ito. So I should set up a PO box, really, for people to just send me stuff if you want to send me the entire Junji Ito collection. I promise I'll read it on stream. No. But you're not going to get much anime out of me. I just don't like the genre tropes. Lots of recommendations. I appreciate the recommendations. My wife is a weeb, she speaks Japanese. The furthest I go these days is some of the Ghibli films. Mononoke, Spirited Away, and Howl's Moving Castle are excellent. Anyway, that isn't the topic of the show, but I had to address that right off the bat, and I apologise for anime discussion immediately at the start. I've just seen another super chat come in, but I will reserve that for the end of the show. I will address relevant items as they come in, but I will address additional questions at the end of the show. So send them in, we'll get to them at the end. However, tonight's topic is much more pertinent. Tonight's topic is Reform UK. Nigel Farage gave a speech today. He was, and he and all of his MPs were interviewed by Jeremy Kyle, who has been coaching Reform candidates on media training, so he hasn't hid his party allegiance, I suppose. Talk and GB News are now both marketing outlets for Reform. That's the way alternative media and right-wing establishment media is in the UK now. Like it or love it, I just call things as I see it. So Farage and the rest of the Reform MPs gave a rally, a press conference of sorts to Reform supporters, and people were anticipating that he was going to announce their shadow cabinet, but instead they complained about the state of the country. They were essentially on resignation watch for Keir Starmer live, and at time of streaming, 8 o'clock at night, Starmer is still hunkered down in Downing Street, like Hitler in Downfall. Morgan McSweeney is gone, his chief of communications has gone. That's the 5th since he took office in July 2024. Peter Mandelson is under investigation by the police. His home was raided, boxes of his belongings were taken out. And Starmer is refusing to fall on his sword and coercing every cabinet minister to coming to his defence, despite many of them having their own leadership ambitions. Wes Streeting, Brutus in waiting himself, has handed over a series of WhatsApps concerning his relationship to Peter Mandelson and made them public, because apparently he organised Peter Mandelson's bachelor party. As you do, despite knowing how dodgy the man is. Because, of course, Wes Streeting's fiancée used to work personally for Mandelson. So I think his leadership ambitions, he's trying to rescue them from sinking, but I think they're all but submerged at this point. Anyway, so Farage, during his speech, he referenced our Judeo-Christian heritage and our foundations and our need to return to them and respect them, no matter what colour or creed or sexuality you are. Boilerplate liberal civic nationalism, essentially. And people will say that this is what reform is just saying in order to get by in the political system to court over middle-of-the-road and centrist voters, but I think this is what a lot of the top party brass, not all of them, but a lot of them, really believe. They are true liberals whose problem with the woke identitarian left is that it is identitarian and that it is divisive. Baked into that presumption is that we have an original position of where we're all just individuals acting in the market, and until the politics of race or gender or sexual orientation rear their ugly heads, we all rub shoulders and get along nicely. I think that's a naive vision, but it's not like it's not one that doesn't correspond to the natural temperament of British people, who just sort of take people as they meet them. We don't want to be made to feel in a groupish fashion. That's just how specifically my generation have been brought up, with, yet again, sectarian identity politics, the grooming gangs, DEI legislation, Black Lives Matter, on and on and on, even on the right, as we'll come to see with Israeli advocacy groups very shortly. And he also mentioned the banning of the Maccabi Tel Aviv football team in Birmingham, and also mentioned, yet again, the industries of the future. AI, data processing centers, cryptocurrencies, all things that have heavy interest and a lot of investment in these sectors in, yes, the US, but also Israel and the United Arab Emirates, or Emiratis. I've heard it pronounced both ways, and I've heard people criticize me for saying it both ways, so I'll probably end up saying it both ways in this stream. So, in the rhetoric that Nigel Farage recycles in all of his public addresses and his off-the-cuff interviews, you're seeing a courting of specific tech sectors and of specific communities, namely the moderate Muslim community and Jewish communities. And, again, I'm not making an indictment on this. I will talk later on about how this might not be a sensible electoral strategy, but I'm just laying things out. And the reason I'm doing the stream is because people have taken this shift in rhetoric. They have noticed Farage's frequent visits to Dubai and Davos in January, and the kinds of people that are joining reform and the institutions building up in and around reform. And they are saying reform is being captured by special interests, donors of foreign, religious or ethnic extractions, and they are more focused now on international politics and the rootless business class that are more at home in an airport lounge than in Aberystwyth or Aberdeen or Stratford-upon-Avon. And they are concerned that reform is losing, if not has lost, its anti-establishment bona fides. And in light of the Epstein Files, well, this produces some bad press for the kinds of people that are endorsing, or at least orbiting, reform. And so I thought I would go through this on stream and just present you with some updates and allow you to draw your own conclusions. And then we can talk about electoral strategy and get into moral prescriptions at the end of it. But most of this stream is going to be a value-free foreign and domestic policy analysis. So let's start with the least contentious topic, of course. Let's talk about Israel. In light of the Epstein Files, Nigel Farage hosted his show when Mandelson was implicated by the Epstein Files for, see my last stream about this, potentially trading state secrets about tunnels beneath Downing Street to the Ministry of Defence, a bailout of the euro to stop Greece from going insolvent, the sale of British assets, and the resignation of Gordon Brown to his best friend Jeffrey Epstein. And on his show, Nigel Farage discussed Epstein's place in a network of international financiers and being the Machiavellian string puller of various states, foreign policy and domestic policy. And, well, let's listen to the conclusion that Nigel Farage reached, having consulted the Epstein Files, for whether or not Epstein is in the pocket of Vladimir Putin.
National secrets. This is a potential breach of the Official Secrets Act. It involves the royal family, it involves senior members of government, and who knows, behind it all, maybe even Epstein could have been working for the Putin regime. I believe that this is bigger than Profumo.
Putin. Okay. Epstein is an agent of the Russians. This is an allegation that was made, of course, by Liberal Democrat leader Sir Ed Davey in the House of Commons. This is an allegation made by Andrew Marr on LBC. This is the normie opinion on the Epstein saga in Britain. There is the American version of the Epstein saga, the sort of hyper-real narrative of ritualistic satanic abuse, parts of this being true, when I say the following: a international paedophile sexual blackmail compromat ring involving some of the members of high society, donors, art collectors, politicians, actors, academics. All these people are bound up and contaminated with their association with Epstein. And some of the most sensationalist claims have taken the headlines, of course. Epstein morphing into a lizard before anonymous tip-line caller's very eyes. George Bush Sr. eating excrement out of a girl's intestines. Donald Trump having personally witnessed the ritualistic sacrifice of babies. And a lot of this sensationalized narrative, for which there is very little evidence, not that there isn't evidence, of course, of child abuse, there is absolutely evidence of that, but of the ritualistic occult abuse. A lot of that obscures the true nature of Epstein's operation, which is that he is one of the central nodes in a network of states, financial brokers, donors, and that this network has a strong ethnic tint, which is, given the pejorative way that Epstein used Goyim in his emails, Jewish supremacists. Now, it wasn't exclusive to Jews, of course. Faraz Modad, who, I hope I've said that right, is a very good Middle East analyst, works at the Lotus Eaters, and did a stream with Laura McIntyre on this recently, has been talking through his reading of the files, and he has noted that Epstein was connecting members of the US chattering class with some of the officials in Qatar funding the Muslim Brotherhood, and yet again, no matter, and I'm watching you chat, people's criticisms of Israel, its foreign policy, the international Israeli lobby in the US and the UK, no matter your criticisms of it, it is a fact that the Qataris have bankrolled the Muslim Brotherhood and been a slush fund for the senior figures and princelings of Hamas for decades. So Qatar is a legitimate security concern. They're a bad faith actor. And Epstein was liaising with them. He was liaising with the Saudis. He was liaising with various European royal families. He was representing the Rothschilds. He was also talking to the Russians, attending the Russian Economic Forum, contacting Putin at various points. So it's not untrue that Epstein had dealings with Russia and with other foreign states. And I think Farage is putting this out there because in light of I think it's the head of Reform Wales going to jail over taking money from the Russians, he wants to scrub himself free of the stink that he's a puppet of Putin. Because, of course, the European continent, there is a lot of concern about the power of Vladimir Putin. We've taken quite a lot of Ukrainian refugees, and our close proximity to the European Union means some of that narrative sticks, especially from the parties who say Brexit was a mistake, like the Liberal Democrats, who want to deepen ties with the EU. And so Farage, not wanting to be seen as a vassal of America, and opposed to Vladimir Putin, has repeatedly repudiated President Trump and Vice President Vance, even if it's damaged his relationship with them, and he is now suggesting that Jeffrey Epstein had strong ties with Russia. I say all of this to say, Nigel is not addressing the elephant in the room, and that is, Epstein did have strong links with senior figures in the Israeli security state, namely former Prime Minister Barak. And Ehud Barak is mentioned frequently throughout the Epstein Files. This is according to Jewish News, Jerusalem Post, rather. We do quote from Jewish News later on. I read the primary sources, what can I say? Barak told Epstein that Israel could easily absorb 1 million immigrants from Russian-speaking countries, according to an undated recording of the conversation released as part of the Epstein Files. So, the Russians, what type of Russian? We're not just talking about the Russians here, are we, ladies and gentlemen? And then, there is, of course, Peter Mandelson. Now, Peter Mandelson himself, ethnically Jewish, and he was asking Jeffrey Epstein for help vetting an Israeli advisor. So, Lord Mandelson, though he's about to be stripped of that title, if Keir Starmer has anything to do with it, was asking for advice, and the email was then forwarded to former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. So Barak and Epstein had a pretty close relationship. Can you ask Ehud whether he thinks of this Israeli guy living in London, Mandelson wrote, about an Israeli political consultant called Asaf Asin. The email, seen by The Times, added, he says he worked on political campaigns for Ehud, thanks Peter. The email was signed off in his role, Peter Mandelson's role, as chairman of Global Counsel, a firm that we're going to be bringing up later, in relation to a government deal done with Peter Thiel and Palantir. And this is the lobbying firm that Mandelson co-founded. Now, Barak is featured frequently throughout the Epstein Files, and this is why, as well as allegations of involvement with the Israeli security state, The Times, and we loathe to quote The Times because, I mean, for example, this is where Danny Finkelstein hosted a podcast of Peter Mandelson, so they are one of the most morally bankrupt publications in Britain, the paper of disrepute now, but they did have a pretty decent article on whether or not Epstein has documented links with Mossad. And Epstein once told a Indian billionaire, Deepak Chopra, who asked him to come out and meet him in Tel Aviv in 2017, he says, I do not like Israel at all. Now, lots of people have been, therefore, pointing to this, saying Epstein had nothing to do with Israel. This is the same thing that Netanyahu said on X recently, that Ehud Barak was on the Israeli left. He doesn't authentically represent Israeli interests, and therefore Epstein was actually working against Israel. If this is the case, then this proves problematic for reform and some of the people from the Israeli left that they're now associating with, but nevertheless, I'm not making a judgment on that. I'm just reading what Epstein was saying about the country, the links he has, and allowing you to form your own conclusions. Epstein in 2018 asked Ehud Barak in an email to make it clear that I don't work for Mossad, smiley face. Lots of people are therefore suspicious because if you have to ask, it raises the question, well, do you? The year before, Epstein asked Barak if someone had asked him to help obtain former Mossad agents to do dirty investigations. Obviously, lots of the files do not look favourably upon Epstein and his involvement with the Israelis. There was a section here that... Here it is. Over the weekend, Netanyahu, of course, suggested his friendship with Barak was evidence that he was not a spy. The newly released files show Barak and his wife Neely regularly stayed in Epstein's New York apartment and planned a visit close to the time of the financier's final arrest and death a month later. So Ehud Barak knew of Epstein's prosecution for soliciting a minor for prostitution. He knew he went to prison for it. He presumably knew something about the broader financial network, at least, that Epstein was running, which seems to have undermined the national security of at least my country, Great Britain. And yet, right up until when Epstein was finally arrested and then died under mysterious circumstances in prison, he was staying at his New York apartment. Their association continued long after Epstein's first arrest. It says here, Barack has since said he regretted his ties to Epstein. Well, those ties are fairly extensive, as we can see in the emails detailed by the Department of Justice. So, here's an email from Leslie Groff to Jeffrey Epstein. Not sure how to do this. Ehud, Barack, wants to surprise you with a birthday phone call. Shall I tell him to call you on the island staff line and you have to act surprised? So at least Ehud Barak knew and visited the island and felt close enough to Jeffrey Epstein to want to give him happy birthday calls after Epstein had gone to prison. Then there is this section where Jeffrey Epstein sent the following email to Ehud Barak. We're not sure if there was a response. He says, did boys ask you to obtain former Mossad agents to do dirty investigations? I believe Boys was the attorney who represented the victims of Epstein in a previous case. So he's asking whether or not, and this is therefore redacted under attorney-client privilege, Barack had spoken about Epstein's relationship with potential Mossad agents to this attorney. And then Epstein alleges that Robert Maxwell, father of his madam, Ghislaine, was killed by Mossad because he tried to extort them for £400 million. So this all seems kind of relevant, doesn't it? Apparently, he was working with MI6 and Mossad to pilfer frozen assets in Libya a month before Gaddafi was killed as well. Here's an email from Greg Brown to Jeffrey Epstein. And he's saying, the real carrot is if we can become their go-to guys because they plan to spend at least $100 billion next year to rebuild their country and jumpstart the economy. Also, remember, Libya is a rich country, as its population is 2 million less than the city of New York, and it has the 9th largest crude oil and natural gas reserves on the planet and a literacy rate of almost 80%. I have friends, formerly with MI6 and Mossad, willing to help identify stolen assets and get them recovered. So they were profiting from war. They were war profiteering, and this is, of course, a war which, like it or not, the neoconservative network, who were very concerned about the security of Israel, championed, pushed for, and it's ultimately ended in Libya with open-air slave markets again. The country's a failed state. It helped result in the febrile climate over there. It helped result in the training and inspiration of the Manchester Arena bombing in 2017. So Epstein and his broader clientele network were profiting from not just the destabilization of Middle Eastern states, but from the destabilization of our countries because the men who claimed refugee status coming from those war zones then come into Britain and wreak all sorts of jihadist havoc, claiming the lives of children. So all of this is very, very important. And so it becomes an elephant in the room when Epstein's ties to Russia, but not, at the very least, the Israeli left and potentially Mossad, are addressed by Britain's politicians. And why isn't Nigel Farage mentioning this? Well, because it would prove inconvenient to the new chapters he's just establishing, the Reformed Jewish Alliance and the Friends of Israel groups. It's possible, I'm not being unfair here, this is Jewish News reporting this, it's possible that these groups being established, you don't want to rock the boat too much regarding Epstein's connections to Jewish supremacists, a broader, wealthy network of Jewish donors and politicians, academics, art dealers like Ronald Lauder. Or, more specifically, you don't want to insult some of those who were implicated by their friendships and business relationships with Jeffrey Epstein, because it turns out that at least one person in Reform's Jewish Alliance and Friends of Israel groups is associated with the broader Jewish left, and therefore, if Netanyahu is saying, well, the Jewish left are contaminated by Ehud Barak's association with Epstein, is this person not also contaminated by their association with the Jewish left? And then the more important question is, of course, and we'll go through these figures in a moment, why is Reform appointing members of the Jewish left in the Reform UK party and its Jewish subsidiaries. Why is it not getting British Jews? I mean, I'm sure there are people in there, but why do you need this guy? And it's probably because of making foreign policy, lubricating discussions between a reform government in Britain and Israel, making them much more fruitful. Repairing bad blood after Keir Starmer's recognition of the state of Palestine and the Israelis stopping sharing intelligence with the Brits because any time they picked up the phone, there was a Muslim on the other end of it. Anyway, Reform have announced the launch next month, so this would be February, of the Reform Jewish Alliance, with both Nigel Farage and Richard Tice scheduled to speak at the opening event, while Jewish News understands that a separate Reform Friends of Israel group will soon be announced. Party sources say Gary Mond, who is a high-profile figure who defected from the Tories to Reform, is at the centre of the Reform Jewish Alliance, aiming to provide members with a programme of regular events featuring guest speakers, including senior Reform politicians and prominent figures from across the Jewish community. Those little left here, of course, because in my previous video about why there are plenty of Jews fleeing Britain and Europe for America and, of course, Israel, that number is dipping below 100,000. So perhaps Reform are looking to bring British Jews back, and especially, it's a stereotype, but it is true, a large amount of money and business that those Jews have that they've taken abroad. You know, they're selling up large homes. They have closed down synagogues and they're being bought up by mosques. There was a Somalian that was campaigning to crowdfund for the purchase of a historic synagogue to convert it into a mosque in Britain not long ago. So perhaps this is part of the broader financial plan, but also part of the broader foreign policy plan to manage the region, because, of course, we're seeing trouble foment again around Iran, and it is true that Miriam Mandelson and former Democrat donors like Bill Ackman invested in the Trump administration because they saw anti-Semitism on college campuses, but also because they knew that the Democrat Party had been appeasing Iran by restarting the pallets of cash being sent over as part of the Iran nuclear deal under the Obama and then the Biden administrations. The moment that money hypothetically became freed up in a South Korean bank account, the Iranians started sponsoring terror proxies in Yemen, the Houthis. They also started, again, putting money towards Hamas. And so softness on Iran is seen as a threat to Israel, especially as things go. Current negotiations with the Iranians to stop them from refining uranium to try and develop a nuclear weapon are going really badly. Steve Witkoff hasn't been able to get the concession out of the Iranians that they're not going to refine uranium up to the level sufficient to create a nuclear weapon. And it's probably very little surprise, given Trump already dropped the bunker buster last year on the Fordo nuclear site, and given the Iranian nuclear refinement centers are deep underground, yes, we had intel that was one of them. It probably isn't the only one, and once you've already got the ability, the capacity to refine uranium in one place, you can easily get the centrifuges spun up elsewhere. You can get them mobile and online. It's like developing a computer, right? The first computer takes a hell of a lot of development time, or AI, I suppose, and then the next few take a fraction of the time to then replicate and refine. Anyway, so the fact that they've just had the USS Abraham Lincoln sail up the Gulf of Oman and then retreat, the fact that the Israelis are becoming bellicose about Iran not just replenishing its stockpiles of missiles, but also potentially funding their proxies again. The fact that there is, of course, a color revolution going on in Iran at the moment after its banks collapsed, and predominantly the ethnic Kurds in the region, which have always been a nation allied with the Israelis, trying to seek a state of their own. That's, of course, advantageous to the Israelis, but also the Emiratis, who would like to contain Islamic radicalism, violent Islam, doctrinaire Islam, to the region, and also disempower some of these larger Islamic states by fracturing them into states of ethnic groups, make the region less concentrated in the form of large post-colonial states, which then arm and take out their ethnic and religious grievances on Israel, or vie for power with their rival Muslims. There's a sort of Islamic bloc forming between like Turkey, Qatar, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia to try and get a handle on the Iran-Israel situation. Because all of this is going on, this has proved a great big distraction for the Trump administration, but the reason that this was going to happen was the reason why the likes of Adelson, the likes of Bill Ackman, donated to the Trump campaign. They're still donating to Trump now. The son-in-law of Ronald Lauder is now queued up to be the nominee for the head of the Federal Reserve after Jerome Powell goes. So there is a lot of, like it was after the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War, there are a lot of American Jews who were mugged by reality after October the 7th and have changed sides and decided to support the Trump administration. And so I think what Reform is banking on is not just to deepen ties with the Trump administration and their goals in the Middle East. Of course, I'm just going to have to mute this person because they're spamming in chat. Not just the goals of aligning with the Americans and their foreign policy in the Middle East to try and ensure peace in the region, to try and ensure that Trump's Gaza Peace Board, featuring Tony Blair and other such strange characters, goes off without a hitch, but also because they want to attract investment, to be a party that is going to be favourable to the global Jewish diaspora and the State of Israel, whereas other parties have been unfavourable or insufficiently strong in their support. So this is about establishing these chapters, is about attracting Jews back to Britain, attracting investment back to Britain, realigning Britain with the foreign policy goals of the US and Israel, and copying the Trump model. So, again, value-free analysis, no matter how you may feel about Israeli and Jewish interest groups inside Reform, this is why they're doing it. Reform Friends of Israel is being established to work with election candidates and other party officials to promote UK-Israel relations. So this is essentially a Reform APAC, right? Very important today, by the way. Nigel Farage, when he was on stage, said that Reform is opening up its candidate applications today. It is very important for you all. Listen to Nigel Farage. Reform's candidate applications are open. You all need to go and apply. Before you apply, make sure you have no social media history. Make sure everything is scrubbed. Make sure that they can't kick you out because Hope Not Hate writes a hit piece on you. Do not be prideful about your Facebook or your X or your Instagram or your YouTube videos. If you are a young man, if you're relatively successful, if you have success in a given sector, be it finance, be it law, be it healthcare, cut loose your social media presence, keep your head down, stay quiet, be clean cut, well suited, well spoken, go and apply to be a candidate, and then, when Reform, at this rate, inevitably win government, we will have our guys on the inside who are much more competent than the yes men and the dog's bodies that just want Nigel Farage to sign their football shirts. Rather than wasting your potential in niche political movements that will be derailed by people with very little discipline or potential Home Office plants throwing Romans outside asylum hotels and taking photos with the optics of a cargo cult of the Third Reich, which are never going to achieve anything. Instead, enter institutions, sign up as Reform candidates, and then when actual political power is within the possession of patriots, we can trust that we have sensible people in control. And the knowledge that this is even possible is, of course, why there is a Reform Friends of Israel chapter that is trying to encourage Reform candidates to be more favourable towards Israel. And the reason for this as well is because any politically engaged young person is lukewarm on Israel at best. They don't buy the dispensationalist Protestant theology of America, not in America, let alone in the UK, where that thing just doesn't exist. They don't buy the sort of liberal, neoconservative platitudes about bellicosity towards Russia, about the need to fight them over there so we don't fight them over here, because since they've been born for most of our lives, we've had failed foreign policy ventures and we followed the Americans into Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. And all it's ended up is more migrants from that region ending up in the UK, Palestinians included, thanks to this Labour government. So what this body is aiming to do is encourage a warmth of feeling towards Israel from a cohort of politicians who are apathetic about it, perhaps skeptical about it, or at the very least don't have Israel as a priority as their own country is falling apart. So it's important for politicians, for candidates entering reform, to keep the country you are most concerned about in mind. Doesn't mean you have to be mean to people who are concerned about Israel. Doesn't even mean that you have to be outright hostile to Israel. Again, I care about Israel as much as I care about Iceland. But there is no Icelandic lobby in Britain. It just means that you have to be focused on Britain first and foremost. And you should be able to easily answer the question, if Israel's interests conflict with Britain's interests, well, which country takes priority in your mind? You should be saying Britain, of course. I know this was a question that tripped Matt Goodwin up on GB News once, and it shouldn't be controversial to say, well, no, Britain's interest comes first and foremost. It doesn't mean we need to be hostile to Israel. It means we can be friends with the country if it's in our interests, if we like the people from there. But it's always Britain, because that's where we live, and there is no Israel for us to escape to if Britain goes under. So, anyway, I like Matt, and that's not me to be disparaging. However, the thing that I am going to be disparaging about, and this is a thing that I've spoken to Jews behind the scenes, and they're pretty pissed about this, actually. The thing I will be disparaging about is the potential director for Reform Friends of Israel, which is Jason Perlman. He is the former advisor to Israel's President Isaac Herzog. Isaac Herzog is the Labour President of Israel. Why the fuck are Reform recruiting an advisor to the Israeli Labour Party to reform Friends of Israel, other than they just want connections within the Israeli government? Jews that are concerned about demographic change, about mass Muslim migration, who are already frustrated by Reform's softness on that particular question, they're not scratching their heads, they're hurling their kippas across the room at the fact that a Jewish leftist is appointed, potentially, as the director of Reform Friends of Israel. They're very frustrated about this. Reform Friends of Israel is being modelled on the Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat Friends of Israel groups. The Labour Friends of Israel, by the way, and the broader Jewish Labour movement often use fighting anti-Semitism as cover for their nefarious political goals. Like, for example, their affiliation with Hope Not Hate, who just had a Labour councillor and director of a synagogue convicted for being a paedophile. So they're hardly the most moral actors ever. So again, be wary of the Israeli left Reform, because they might say, oh, we're supporting Israel, we're trying to fight anti-Semitism, but there might be a bunch of leftist reprobates that follow in their wake, if not this specific guy. The Reform Jewish Association announced a launch event next month, so February, in central London. Another aim of the group is to create a clear channel for members to share their views and help shape Reform's approach to issues that matter most to their community. Someone in chat has just said, Majid Nawaz is a great barometer. If he drops support for Farage, then I'd worry. The interesting thing on this is that Majid Nawaz is saying that Reform are aware of the neoconservative, bellicose Zionist factions in the Trump camp and, of course, in UK politics, and therefore, because of that awareness, despite the presence of such factors as we're going to go through, he's willing to support them. I am equally as concerned about the Islamic factions, just to be very clear. I've met Majid. Nice guy. Again, I should set something up with him at some point. Perhaps even talk about this. It might be of interest. But I don't think Majid and I agree on the end vision of what Britain should be like. I think it should be far less liberalistic and pluralistic. But I think he has a sober mind for international policy. There's some motivated reasoning, but a sober analysis of the factors that led up to the conflicts in the Middle East. And so, if you are concerned about that sort of thing, perhaps his word carries weight regarding reform being a safe pair of hands and not being neoconservative and interventionist in the Middle East in their foreign policy. But anyway, the Dr. Alan Mendoza mentions here, who defected from the Conservatives to Reform, who was a former founding head of the Henry Jackson Society, has become Farage's chief advisor on global affairs. So you can see this sort of anti-jihad, anti-Semitism, managing a moderate version of Islam doctrine of domestic and foreign affairs is in the driving seat over at Reform. Again, this is something I have my issue with, but the Henry Jackson Society has done good work, especially spawning Sir William Shawcross, who then went on to write the Prevent Review, that was a damning indictment of Prevent for being captured by Islamic groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, therefore why they've stopped monitoring Islamic terror. So, the other interesting part, as well, is the Conservative Friends of Israel group has announced that Greg Smith will be its new parliamentary chair in the House of Commons because Suella Braverman, who is the previous head, has of course defected to Reform, and it's likely that Suella will be involved in some instrumental way to the Reform Friends of Israel. Likewise, Robert Jenrick, because he spoke at the Conservative Friends of Israel event in 2024 at Conservative Party conference, where he said a Star of David should be over every entry portal in the arrivals lounge of a UK airport, because it should show that Israel is our ally. Now, Suella Braverman's husband is Jewish. Rael has been a member of Reform on and off, but now firmly on for quite some time. And of course, Robert Jenrick's wife is Israeli-American. She's a lawyer, and his children are Jewish. So they have a personal familial connection, much like President Trump, of course, with Ivanka being married to Jared Kushner and his grandchildren being Jewish. They have a personal connection and therefore investment in seeing the Jewish diaspora, or British Jewish community, who've been here for a few hundred years in many cases. Not individual people, of course, that would be miraculous. And therefore, Israel thrive and survive. So, again, articulating the motivations of these people is not necessarily an endorsement of all the states involved. And I say that as a preface to the next section, because in the light of the Epstein Files, in light of Epstein's international business relationships, Reform has gotten some bad press in the last week. This has mainly been confined to X and then bits of Bloomberg and the Financial Times, which we're going to go through. But Israel wasn't the only thing that came out worse for wear from the Epstein Files. Peter Thiel. Now, Peter Thiel, of course, has become a bit of a bogeyman recently because of Palantir. People are concerned that his algorithm tech firm, nebulous though it is, it's essentially an operating software that's now been adopted by the Pentagon and various government departments to aggregate and sort through data. People are concerned, one, because he keeps talking about the Antichrist so often that they're worried he might be the candidate, but two, people are concerned that Peter Thiel's involvement, now with Reform, is reflective of Reform becoming a vassal for a proxy battle between Oracle, Larry Ellison's Oracle, which has funded the Tony Blair Institute with millions, helped staff it, and thereby helped staff Keir Starmer's government and influence its policy on things like digital IDs and procurement contracts for the NHS, HMRC, Department for Work and Pensions. They're worried there is a proxy battle going on between Larry Ellison's Oracle and Peter Thiel's Palantir to become the well-funded operating software of the British state, and that both firms engage in widespread surveillance. Larry Ellison apparently once said that he wants surveillance at all times, including of you when you go to the toilet, and then your software can recognize that you're on the toilet and then retroactively deletes it from that, but everything you ever do will be recorded. No thanks, I don't want to live in the digital panopticon that Shabana Mahmood proposed to Tony Blair. People are worried that whether or not Oracle or Palantir become the operating software of the British state, the British people lose. We lose our civil liberties, our ancient custom of privacy, of an Englishman's home being his castle to do with in which as he pleases, so long as nobody else is harmed. And therefore, people are concerned not only by Peter Thiel's growing closeness to Reform, as he has been very close to J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson, and therefore the Trump administration. But also people are concerned in light of revelations from the Epstein Files. So Peter Thiel is mentioned frequently throughout the Epstein Files. So this is reporting from Wired. New files show that Thiel arranged to meet with Epstein several times between 2014 and 2017. What are you up to on Friday? Thiel wrote to Epstein on the 5th of April 2016. Should we try and get lunch? And then there was a strange email that detailed Thiel's stringent dietary requirements that Wired made the headline hook of this piece for some reason. But the more interesting points about this are, there was a conversation between Epstein and, again, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, part of the files. Epstein told Barak he was hoping to meet Thiel the following week. And he added that he was familiar with Thiel's company Palantir, but proceeded to spell it out loud for Barak as Palantir. Epstein speculated that Thiel might put Barak on the board of Palantir, though there's no evidence that ever occurred. And there was some insinuation that Barak would then get a job in the US security state, because Palantir, as part of Elon Musk's Doge attempts over at the Pentagon, has become enmeshed with now the Department of War, and has become the operating software for the American military-industrial complex. So Peter Thiel has got quite a nice carve-out for himself as a result of the Trump administration. Of course, he heavily invested in J.D. Vance. He allowed Vance to work at Palantir. He invested in Vance's venture capital firm. He allowed Vance to write his book, Hillbilly Elegy, which made him a near-household name while he's working at Palantir. He funded J.D. Vance's Senate run. He, along with Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson, pushed for Vance to become vice president. And I'm sure, therefore, he's respecting a return on investment should Vance be coronated in 2028. And this is now proving a bit of a problem within MAGA, because a lot of these links are being raised, and the fact that these links can all be corroborated and pointed out without sounding like a schizo conspiracy theorist, without saying, Epstein's a lizard and people are engaging in ritualistic sacrifice, the fact that these can be pointed out, and then, thanks to the DOJ, it's pointed out that Epstein put $40 million in two funds managed by one of Thiel's investment firms, Valar Ventures. People are going, well, this association doesn't look great. Now, again, Palantir is a large organization, right? Palmer Luckey works at Arandwyl, named after the sword forged from the shards of Narsil from the Lord of the Rings. Of course, Palantir is also named after the quite nefariously, if I might say, after the orb that Sauron and Saruman used to communicate. So the idea that it's a algorithmic surveillance company that is named after the orb used by the all-seeing eye that is the Dark Lord villain of the Lord of the Rings, and the guy's going around calling himself the Antichrist, makes people uneasy, to say the least. But this isn't to say there aren't decent people working in Palantir. So I've met Lewis Mosley before. Yes, that Lewis Mosley. Nice chap, total patriot. I'm sure whatever he gets involved in politics, he'll be an asset to them. J.D. Vance, we all hope he's the real deal, right? He's excellent in interviews. He seems sound on industrial policy and immigration. He seems like our guy. People are just worried that he's inauthentic or that he is in hoc to, again, donors and nefarious influences. And so, in light of these revelations from the Epstein Files, in light of Epstein and Thiel continuing to communicate until January 2019, not long before Epstein died, there are questions being raised about the UK government's procurement contracts with Palantir. So, the Financial Times is reporting that Starmer has been questioned about his visit to the Palantir office alongside Peter Mandelson. This was in Washington in February of 2025. And during the visit, which was arranged by Peter Mandelson's office, Starmer met Palantir chief executive Alex Karp and the company's UK chief Lewis Mosley at the company's showroom on the 27th of February 2025. Starmer held a press conference with then Donald Trump later in that day. Several months later, Karp signed a strategic partnership with the Ministry of Defense in which the government agreed to spend $750 million on Palantir's defense technology over the next 5 years. As part of that agreement, Palantir last month won a £240 million contract from the Ministry of Defense for data analytics capabilities supporting critical strategic, tactical, and live operational decision-making over 3 years. The deal was worth 3 times more than a previous Ministry of Defense agreement the company signed in 2022. So, Palantir is securing lucrative contracts using contacts established by Peter Mandelson, who had business and personal relationships with Jeffrey Epstein. And Peter Thiel himself seems to have taken $40 million at least into his venture capital firms from Jeffrey Epstein, was associating with Epstein until 2019. All very concerning. A person involved in the meeting told the Financial Times that it lasted 45 minutes, and Palantir executives chatted to the Prime Minister about defense investment in the context of growing threats to international security. I would have thought that Jeffrey Epstein was probably a pretty big threat to international, but in Britain's context, national security. So, of course, there are questions being raised about the government's being influenced by Peter Mandelson, Peter Thiel, and thereby their mutual business associate Jeffrey Epstein. And now the chief of Mandelson's investment firm, which he went through in order to speak to Epstein, this was the Global Counsel firm, has now resigned. Global Counsel told its clients on Friday that Benjamin Wegg-Prosser, who founded the business with Mandelson, has decided to step down and is being replaced by Rebecca Park. The firm has also struck a deal for Mandelson to sell his 21% stake in the business. So the rats are jumping the sinking ship after their affiliation with Epstein and their international business relationships have been brought to light. And this was the firm, by the way, that Mandelson was using to swan around in China, securing the investment deals. That now cast doubt on whether or not Keir Starmer is pursuing the Chagos deal, where he is giving Mauritius money to take the islands to allow, because Mauritius is on the Belt and Road scheme, the Chinese to look around a US-UK military base, Diego Garcia. Keir Starmer's visit to Beijing, his abandonment of Jimmy Lai, who's just been sentenced to prison today, I think for another 20 years, his insistence that Chinese students can visit Britain without the need for a visa, and his allowing the Chinese to build a massive embassy on old Royal Mint property atop telecommunications cables that they could easily hack and intercept data. After them having spied on cabinet minister from the previous government, it casts doubt on whether or not Keir Starmer made all those decisions in purely the national interest, or whether they were in Peter Mandelson's interest, because Mandelson has something on Starmer. So Mandelson is now, and another chap quoted here by Bloomberg, is saying he had no role in the Palantir deal. But the very fact that Mandelson's name is being banded around with Palantir in the UK, the very fact that Jeffrey Epstein's name is now being paired for Peter Thiel's, means that question marks will be raised any time a political party or a person associates with Peter Thiel going forward. Apparently, according to Bloomberg, Mandelson played no role in facilitating the award of a £240.6 million contract to Palantir. This is according to the UK's Defence Secretary John Healey. The contract was awarded without a competitive tender by the Ministry of Defence in December, so it was all but handed to Palantir on a platter. Has attracted scrutiny in the wake of the scandal over Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, as well as Peter Thiel's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Mandelson co-founded Global Counsel, which listed Palantir among its clients on the most recent register of its lobbying interests. So, the investment firm that Mandelson co-founded with Benjamin Wegg-Prosser, both men had just resigned, had Palantir as one of its contacts, as one of its clients. So, bear in mind, Palantir has lots of firms that it works with for investment in various countries, but this doesn't look good. It doesn't look good. At the time, Mandelson's December 2024 appointment to the Washington role was controversial, in part because he simultaneously retained a stake in Global Counsel, the firm which advises Palantir. The firm is now in the final stages of a deal to remove Mandelson from the business. Peter Mandelson has no influence on any Ministry of Defence contracts, Healey said in an interview with Bloomberg. The Palantir decision was mine. The fact that we're even questioning because we were lied to about Mandelson before doesn't look good. The UK's original defence contract with Palantir, valued at $75 million, was awarded by the Conservative government in 2022, also without a competitive process. So again, there's going to be allegations of cronyism here. Now, it could just be that this is the most efficient procurement strategy. It could just be that Palantir is top of the market. It could just be that Larry Ellison of Oracle is a pretty shady figure, and the government, this and the last, decided that Peter Thiel is a much more trustworthy investment partner. But, again, given he took $40 million at least from Jeffrey Epstein, his trustworthiness is in doubt. And full disclosure, by the way, I've met Peter Thiel before. I went to a seminar, it must have been like a year and a half ago now, where he was talking about the Antichrist, and I had an exchange with him about whether or not there was something innate, as the Nietzschean vitalist bros accuse of Christianity, that makes it susceptible to fetishizing weakness, and therefore whether or not Christianity itself will be incapable of resisting the Antichrist in its current form. It's an interesting discussion. And he has swanned around in right-wing circles, funding things like, Passage Press and appearing at ARC. So he's made himself a fixture of emerging, counter-elite, dissident right-wing politics. But now, his business association with Jeffrey Epstein makes him a difficult person to associate with and to keep one's hands clean. And so, and I hope I don't jeopardize a friendship by drawing attention to this, it's unfortunate timing when he's just been giving the Antichrist lectures again in Cambridge, hosted by James Orr. James is a good man. James is, I think, firmly on the right of reform, and I think James is overall going to be a good influence on the party from the inside, even if he affiliates with some of the more soft people within reform, like Danny Kruger. But this is not good. It's not a good look, at the very least, right? And there was a write-up of these lectures, which I wasn't invited to, by the way, and I think we all know, chat, the reason is, if the lectures themselves had to be carefully framed, they weren't recorded, I don't think, and they haven't been posted anywhere online, but they have been reviewed in, of all publications, of course, The Spectator. If the publication of quotes from these lectures had to have their framing carefully curated, I think having me there with a fairly large audience and my ability to just run my mouth on a live stream would have been a liability. So, no hard feelings about not being invited this time, especially in light of recent Epstein revelations, but I think it's fair to say that I'm firmly out the club on pretty much everything. Anyway, in the write-up, this is from John Power and Laura Brown, they explained that Thiel's quest to identify the Antichrist provides a useful staging post for him to discuss his other more profane reflections on the United Kingdom, whether about Reform UK, the Rwanda scheme, or taxes. While Thiel is fond of Britain, he believes we've made a serious error by not controlling our crazy immigration or taking advantage of the tech-powered growth the United States has. Data processing, cryptocurrency, AI, all of the industries that Nigel Farage has been talking about repeatedly, who they are central to his net zero strategy. He wants to get off net zero so he can power all of these computing tech-heavy industries. And also he's looking to attract investment, as he mentioned when he had Nadim Zahawi defect, something he celebrated again today, as well as Nadine Dorries and Jake Berry. Dear Lord, why? It's because Nadim Zahawi does a lot of business in the UAE and the broader Middle East, and Zahawi was attracted to the party because the party were promising to ban the Muslim Brotherhood, making his deals in both the UK and the Middle East much easier. A lot of it's about Middle Eastern foreign politics and attracting investment. Anyway, so Thiel says he hopes Britain can stand up to a vengeful American administration if the Democrats are elected in 2028, perhaps even acting as a refuge for the politically persecuted. Well, we've just had Sarah Rogers, the envoy in the UK from the State Department, say that Brits being persecuted for free speech under Starmer and his successor can start to claim asylum in the US. So if it starts going the other way around, there's going to be nowhere to run to, right? In this sense, Britain is like New Zealand, where Thiel has acquired citizenship and bought land to help him establish a refuge in times of international discord. The pursuit of a safe jurisdiction may explain Thiel's preoccupation with British politics. He says that reform is the best option for Britain, and it's not even close, and it's the only chance Britain has. This is not just a nod to the host James Orr. Thiel has a specific dislike of the Conservative Party. And he goes on to talk about Rwanda being an unserious idea, considers the removal of the non-dom scheme by the last Tory government to be a part of a wider strategy to make it impossible to hide money from international governance structures, and by extension, he says the Antichrist. And this attraction of non-doms back is why Zia Yusuf announced the Britannia card. I think we all remember this, I did a video on it at the time, but it allows high earners to come to Britain and not pay any income tax because the wealth they generate, the things they spend their money on are considered enough of a subsidy to allow them to stay. So the idea is that we become a revolving door for the international wealthy business class. I don't like this idea on cultural grounds, but it makes economic sense. And this is the kind of thing that the finance bros will fight for as a faction of reform. I think there are other considerations that take precedent over generating GDP per capita, not just GDP, by attracting wealthy foreign investment. I think cultural considerations matter too, and I happen to believe that we frankly have the best people in the world if we just stop holding our own talent back, like capping medical school placements or crippling investment with things like capital gains taxes and corporation taxes. I think that we'll just do fine on our own, but that's not the strategy reform has. And so, courting Thiel, courting the international financial class, courting the tech sector, is key to their policies of financial rejuvenation, of replenishing the economy of its depleted reserves, of trying to balance the budget. That's what they're relying on, because reform have a difficult economic model at the moment of trying not to seem like ardent Thatcherites, even though those are their instincts, because their red wall vote are hostile to the austerity measures, which were championed but never actually enacted by the Conservative government. They're quite wedded to the broader welfare state of benefits in the NHS and pensions, and so they realise that they will alienate a substantial part of their national populist voter base. The same formula that delivered Trump a second term on his third attempt to become president, with economic protectionism, big state, but also concern about culture, demographics, and advocacy for mass deportations. They realise that they don't want to cut welfare, and so they're going to have a massive welfare bill by cutting taxes while also promising welfare spending and getting off the fudging the numbers with the GDP model by importing loads of low-wage immigrants model. And so what they want to do is attract back investment to inject a lot of liquid capital into the economy to try and boost the economy to a sufficient degree that they can retain some of the welfare state while restricting access to it to British nationals and British-born people, and get people back into work. So, bold move, Cotton. We'll see if it will pay off, but this is just explaining their mentality, right? The problem with all of this is Thiel coming out and endorsing reform the same week that he ends up in the Epstein Files doesn't look great. And so people are worried that, much like concerns are starting to be spread over J.D. Vance, who obviously James Orr was a mentor of, people are worried that reform is being captured by its donors and by the international financial class who were all too happy to continue to rub shoulders with Jeffrey Epstein despite his convictions for soliciting a minor for prostitution. And this worry is not confined to reform's base. This is the reason I'm covering this, because now a top MI5 spy chief, which is MI5 Director General Ken McCallum, and the National Cybersecurity Center Chief Executive Officer Richard Horne, held a security briefing for the heads of every major political party in Britain. And they were warning about worries of foreign intelligence interference in various parties. And this was, of course, fresh off the back of Nathan Gill, a former Welsh leader of Reform, being convicted for taking bribes in exchange for making statements in favour of Russia while serving as a member of the European Parliament. Reform is also coming under scrutiny for a donation of £200,000 from an Iranian billionaire. So it's not just that Nadim Zahawi is an Iraqi Kurd, and Nadim Zahawi does a lot of business in the Middle East, and he's just defected to Reform, but it's also that there are Iraqi billionaires giving money to Reform, hence why, possibly, Nigel Farage showed up at the pro-Iranian revolution protest only a few weeks ago. So people are worried yet again that money is dictating reform policy and drawing its attention away from domestic British political affairs, softening its stance on things like mass deportations or cultural prescriptions against Islam, and drawing its focus towards foreign policy and trips to Davos and Dubai. Remember, there was a Muslim property magnate who was a former member of the World Economic Forum who gave a large donation to reform last year. And people were worried that this was why Nigel Farage went to Davos. I did an entire video on this last month. People are worried, for example, and I know this for a fact, that a large number of donors to reform are Muslim. Tommy Robinson has spoken about before people who have gone into reform donor dinners and seen all the people at the head table are Pakistani Muslims. I was told by a reform source that many donors to Reform UK are just Muslim men with Bradfordian accents that Zia Yusuf happens to run into at the gym and invites to various donor drinks functions. So, people are concerned that the large volume of foreign origin capital is setting the foreign policy and domestic policy priorities for reform. And there are receipts for all this stuff. It's to the extent to where the security services are now speaking to reform. Not that the security services are usually to be trusted, don't get me wrong. You need a complete clear out. We went through on a previous stream about how Britain has become the Longhouse, about how the security services have been ideologically captured by DEI. I'm not saying that they're right on everything. I'm just saying the reason people are worried is because of this repetitive reporting on the various threads between members of Epstein's network, foreign countries, foreign billionaires who may not have Britain's national and cultural interest primarily at heart, and throwing money at reform expecting it to become the next party of government. Ergo, they expect a return on whatever investment they give. It's not like it's unwarranted to be concerned. And especially not unwarranted because Farage has just been in Dubai again. Now, Farage has been in Dubai twice in the last couple of months. He went to Dubai in December for the F1 to have meetings with senior members of the Emiratis government, and it was paid for by the UAE government. And from there, well, before then, but from there, came a reiterated commitment to banning the Muslim Brotherhood, which is something that the Emiratis want because they want to control Islamic radicalism both in their region and in the UK ahead of prospectively investing. And this is why they're no longer recognising certifications from UK universities in their country, so they're not sending their wealthy students over. And this is something that everyone in Reform was unanimously tweeting about when it was published in the Financial Times and the Times, drawing attention to the fact that, oh no, we're not going to get any more rich Emiratis coming and studying and living in Britain. It's like, why is this important to you? Well, because of the money. So, our Reform's priority is its public pronouncements, its foreign policy, its domestic economic policy being driven by foreign and donor interests, potentially. So, Farage hosted a private lunch in Dubai on, this is Tuesday, so this would have been Tuesday the 20th or 27th of January, with the backing of an Indian billionaire called Sunny Varkey, which is now, it says, underscoring Reform's party's embrace of wealthy donors based in the United Arab Emirates. Farage was accompanied at the event by Nadim Zahawi and Nick Candy. Nick Candy, the property developer who has become, well, he's meant to be Reform's chancellor, but someone else is actually managing the books. Nick Candy is just well connected with various donors, and so he's like the front man, introducing them to donors. I can't remember who the guy's name is who's actually doing all the accounting behind the scenes. The luncheon was held at Rockfish, which is a beachside seafood restaurant, with invitations sent out to a select group of wealthy expatriates and Emiratis. So they're looking to encourage both foreign investment and wealthy Britons back to the UK. And look, I went to the annual Restore Britain dinner last year, and there are guys that want to come back to Britain who have left for places like Dubai because they pay no income tax and they run like crypto businesses or something like that. And so there are these kinds of people. So look, it's important to engage in diplomacy to get these kinds of Brits back. It's just, what do you sacrifice in the process? What are you not talking about to not upset the Reform Friends of Israel members? What are you willing to put up with from the domestic Muslim community in order to attract investment from the Emiratis. Various trade-offs are being made for the sake of appeasing donors, foreign and domestic. The involvement of Vaki, an education entrepreneur based in Dubai, was not widely advertised ahead of the event. Interesting that he's part of education, by the way. Because we will see here the figure of Paul Marshall and the procurement of the Telegraph to become part of the broader Marshall network alongside GV News and Talk, which are both, well, Talk is part of the Murdoch empire, but Murdoch is very pro-Israel, and the Daily Mail, also part of the Murdoch empire, is collaborating with Marshall to try and buy the Telegraph. But GV News and Talk are basically promotional outlets for reform at this point. And so what you're seeing is an amassing of capital, foreign and domestic, to try to build a media apparatus to ensure that Nigel Farage is delivered Downing Street on a silver platter. And Keir Starmer's going the right way about it, don't get me wrong, so maybe they don't need as much help as they think. But the reason I bring this up is because Paul Marshall met Michael Gove when he was an advisor at Michael Gove's Department of Education under the coalition government of the Tories and the Lib Dems post-2011, because Paul Marshall was originally a Liberal Democrat. He helped author the Orange Book, which was the policy prospectus that Nick Clegg used to reform the Liberal Democrats to become sort of social democrat parties, sort of like left capitalist, welfare statist, but pro-business. So education is a key interest of Paul Marshall. It's also a key interest of Michael Gove. It's a key interest of the man who is flying Farage out to Dubai and hosting lucrative lunches with wealthy expats and Emiratis. Just worthy of taking note. According to data from the third quarter of last year, Reform received £9 million, which is the largest sum a political party has ever received from a living donor, from Thailand-based crypto investor Christopher Harborne, hence why Reform keeps going on about crypto. Overall, Reform accepted more than £10 million in private donations in that quarter, out fundraising all other political parties combined. Very impressive, but again, makes people worried about the influence that donors are having on the direction of party policy. The UAE is seen by Reform to be the key to its trade and foreign policy strategy, according to one person familiar with the matter. Can't get a better quote than that. But just days after Farage returned from the World Economic Forum's annual summit in Davos, the Dubai jaunt is likely to amplify criticism from political rivals that Farage rarely spends time in Clacton. Of course, that's going to come from the left. The criticism from the right is, if you are meant to be a party of British people, by British people, for British people, why aren't you focusing on Britain? Why instead are you focusing on the UAE and Israel and Saudi Arabia and the international tech sector? Concerning. Vaki's global education management systems owns nearly 20 fee-paying schools across England, and of course, the UK Labour Party imposing the removal of a VAT exemption on private schools means that the viability of parents sending their children to private schools goes down. And the free school system was a system that was pioneered by Paul Marshall and Michael Gove. This is the system that enables the Michaela School, which many of you will know not just from my censored debate with both Catherine Burble-Singh, its headmistress, and Michael Gove, but from the recent discussion that Catherine Burble-Singh had with Carl Benjamin on lotuscaesars.com, in which I felt that my argument was drastically mischaracterized, and I have since put out corrections, because no, it wasn't the case that I opposed Michaela's disciplinarian practice because I'm just a Zoomer who doesn't know any better because I didn't go to a pre-modern school. It's that I think that you can't teach kids to be English. It's that I think if you give the children of immigrants a better education than the vast majority of British schools, then all you generate is an immigrant governing class over a ethno-cultural fractured Britain that was broken by politicians against the wishes of the electorate. And so we're going to get more Muslim home secretaries, more Muslim foreign secretaries, more Muslim heads of the Home Office. And also, it's not going to work if you allow the children to retain their religious convictions, as demonstrated by their headscarves, Sikh or Hindu, or not Hindu, Muslim. It's not going to work if they retain their deeply held and entrenched religious convictions, as imparted onto them by their family, which cannot be overcome by a few years at Michaela School singing God Save the King and reading Shakespeare. Anyway, none of that was mentioned in that debate, but I will. Just making the point that The free school program, which is dear to the heart of Michael Gove and Paul Marshall, is becoming central to Reform's domestic, economic and foreign policy prospectus, given his presence in Dubai. And speaking of Paul Marshall, on the Wednesday, Farage delivered a speech at an event hosted by GB News. This trip, it says, is the second visit Farage said to the Emiratis in 2 months. In December, the UAE government paid for him to attend the Grand Prix and meet senior officials at a cost of around £10,000, according to his register of financial interests. Zahawi, who was born in Iraq but fled to the UK as a refugee, spends a significant chunk of his time in Dubai where he owns residential property. And Richard Tice, of course, frequently travels to the city to visit Isabel Oakeshott, his fiancée. So they have a lot of nested interests in the Middle East, and it seems to be dictating where Nigel Farage spends his time and who he talks to. And so what are the details of that GB News event? Well, he told an audience that Britain is in decline, and he is positioning himself to save it. This was at the lunch. He says, "What I've noticed now is that nearly all of London lives in Dubai. They fled for various reasons, and one of the reasons is a bloke called Sadiq Khan, who is the mayor of London. It is a complete disaster. Law and order is collapsing. We're taxing everyone out of the country. When we're in government, some of the Brits will come back to London. At least I hope some of you might come back to London for some of the year." It points out that, again, Zahawi owns property in the country, and Farage is going to return to London for the GB News event. Return following the GB News event. So the GB News event is reported here by the Middle East Eye, and it says he gave the speech at the private party. Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber, the UAE's Ministry of Industry and Advanced Technology, Bitcoin, blockchain, cryptocurrency, AI, large data processing, smart cities being rolled out, not just in Gaza as part of the Gaza Peace Board by Jared Kushner, but also across Saudi Arabia to make it more of a tourist-friendly region. All of these things are bound up in the interest of the region. All of these things are of the interest in the economic and policy prospectus of reform. He attended the party, which was held on the rooftop of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. I believe that Layla Cunningham was at this as well as Nadim Zahawi, which is very interesting. He says, "Look around at the Palm. I want Clacton to look like this." So he wants Clacton to look like Dubai. Do the residents of Clacton want Clacton to look like Dubai? Not sure about that. He praised the UAE for banning the Muslim Brotherhood and promised to do the same. "We have a lot to learn from you, my dear sirs," he said, addressing the Emirati officials. Very supplicant. "We recognise you are our friends. A Brexit London, a Reform London will remember you." So promising to reward as a system of patronage the officials of the UAE before he's in government. Very interesting. He hasn't, by the way, but he's been pushing for, Farage, a meeting with the president of the UAE, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. It says here, Layla Cunningham, Reform's candidate for London Mayor, was spotted at the party, so was Nadim Zahawi. And then, after this event, it was published on GB News that Farage did an interview with a senior Emirati minister. So people were wondering why there seemed to be this sort of pro-Dubai puff piece, nearly propaganda, being broadcast on GB News. Because Farage was talking to Reem Al-Hashimi, who is the Minister of State for International Cooperation in the Foreign Ministry, female as well. And he was saying, "It does seem to me like there's actually quite a great affection for the United Kingdom amongst the people here, trying to talk up pro-UAE British relations ahead of a reform government. There really is," she said. "We have such a historic relationship that spanned decades, really." Okay, well, look, we've got pubs older than America, so it's not really that historic. Not being a dick, but come on. "And that's grown over time to include a lot of investment, a lot of economic opportunities, cultural and educational opportunities. And over the years, we've been able to build that out. I think trade last year is 25 billion, growing almost 10% a year, and we're looking forward to doing more with our UK partners now, looking towards the future, aka looking towards a reform government." Farage said, "The city is booming. I've never seen more construction cranes anywhere in the world, but there's been one change in our trade relationship and our human relationship, and that is now the incredible fact that 250,000 British people are in Dubai alone. We've lost 250,000 Brits to Dubai. That's mad. I can't understand why people would ever want to go there. I stopped off in the airport on my way to Australia, and I think the entire country, or the city, more broadly. It's just the airport. I would never feel at home there, but there you go. Why are they all coming to you, he asked. She said, we have people from all over the world who see the city, who see the country as a destination that is safe, that has great economic opportunities, great schools, great culture, and that's what attracts them to come and set up a business and be part of the development story of the UAE. And then they did another article from the clips talking about Britain being compromised by Islamic groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, like Hizb ut-Tahrir. There was another Emirati journalist who went on Camilla Tominay's show last year around the time of ARC, who said that you have more extremists here than you do in the Middle East. That article has since been taken offline, but it has been archived. And in the conversation, the Emirati's official said to Nigel Farage that she was absolutely aboard about the ban on the Muslim Brotherhood not being brought forward by the government. It was proposed in 2015 under the Conservative government's review of the Muslim Brotherhood activity, including saying that the Muslim Association of Britain and the Muslim Council of Britain are front groups of the Muslim Brotherhood. Don't blame me, it's in a government report. And yet, nobody chose to ban them, and it's because, frankly, and you can see all my reporting on this, the British security state has been entirely captured by Islamic activists. She said, Nigel Farage said to her, you prescribed, banned, declared a terrorist organisation, the Muslim Brotherhood, back in 2014. From what I can see, you've been very, very strict on radical Islam. Hashimi agreed, saying, there's a real difference, in our view, between the faith and the religion, which is a private relationship one has with the divine, and between any attempt to politicise that religion. This is not supported by the comprehensive reading of the Quran that says that the Quran was written on a stone tablet in heaven before the dawn of time, that all things are determined by Allah, that all events that have happened and will happen have always happened according to what is written in paradise, and according to the principles of abrogation, which means that various clerics, because the 114 surahs have been arranged in a non-chronological order, then the clerics have to interpret the verses and will put the Medina sword verses later than the original Mecca revelation verses, meaning that violence takes precedent, meaning that jihad is not just internal spiritual struggle, but is a violent war against sources of temptation, fitna, and against unbelievers. So, look, there is this line from moderating capitalist Muslim countries that this isn't real Islam, when what they really mean is that they are focused on their ethnicity and their culture and their ruling class, and they're less attentive to what the text prescribes. Whereas the authentic Muslim states are more Pakistan, Iran, various jihadist groups across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and embedded in the UK, the sort of Deobandis and Wahhabists. And even though Sunni and Shia are debating as to whether or not, or rather, who should succeed as caliph, Sunnis believe it's divinely appointed, whereas the Shias believe that it's the direct descendant, or at least the return of one of Muhammad's offspring who was cheated out of it. Whether or not they agree on who the caliph should be, they both agree on the caliph, because it's foundational to Islam. So, look, all of this theological debate is besides the point. Trying to cleave a distinction between political Islamists, fundamental Islamists, and hypothetical peaceful moderate Muslims is just trying to get Muslims not to read their own text too much, and I don't think we should gamble our future on that. But this is the distinction that Reform are seeking to pursue through their advisors from the Henry Jackson Society, through their counter-jihad advocates in Reform Friends of Israel and the Reform Jewish Association, through their associations with the United Arab Emirates, pursuing business deals through Nadim Zahawi. So this is why Farage is so out in Dubai so much. This is why GB News are platforming Farage's interviews with UAE ministers. They're saying that, if we get the Muslim Brotherhood under control, there won't be a problem with radical Islam in the UK, and we can attract moderate Muslim investors and students back over to inject some money into the economy. And they're even depicting the UAE as some sort of progressive, moderate paradise. We have 200 different nationalities from all over the world. Muslim faith celebrates differences as opposed to maligns the differences, and Islamist tendencies can be really, really rotten in that way. Again, just not true. See what Muslims think of Christians and Jews. Not befriending them, killing them before Judgment Day. denying the incarnation of Christ, saying he's going to return, abolish the jizya, shatter his cross, and tell all the followers to submit to Allah. So not the most respectful, frankly. It's about as bad as the Talmud is for Jesus. But there you go. But this is also the reason why Farage has changed his tune on the purchase of the Telegraph. Previously, Nigel Farage said that a UAE-based investment firm, Redbird Capital, who bought The Spectator and procured it for Paul Marshall and then gave it to Marshall's company OQS Media, which also owns Unheard and Apollo, which is headed up by Freddie Sayers, the man who cancelled my debate with Michael Gove and censored it. Redbird Capital was going to buy the Telegraph. This sale had to be approved by the House of Lords. This is partially why the Conservatives packed out the House of Lords with allies they thought would vote on it. Think Nigel Biggar, the head of ARC Research, yes, Jordan Peterson's ARC, which Paul Marshall owns. Think Claire Fox was already going to vote on this. Fraser Nelson was writing about it constantly. Lord Toby Young, who of course runs a free speech union and writes for The Spectator, they were going to vote for the sale to make the Telegraph part of the Marshall Empire because, and this is not me saying this is nefarious here, but because they want to build a counter-establishment media network that, again, delivers Downing Street to Nigel Farage, because they think that reform are the one last hope that Britain has. So, Nigel Farage was kind of a stick in the spokes for this plan because he had already publicly opposed the sale. But he said, now, Britain itself was not very straight with the United Arab Emirates over its attempt to buy the Telegraph. He criticised the UK's handling of the takeover during his visit to Dubai. Lisa Nandy scuppered this, I think, shortly after coming into government as Culture Secretary. He said previously he would be deeply uncomfortable if it had gone ahead. The UK decided to block the acquisition by Redbird IMI, and the Redbird negotiations were being led by Nadim Zahawi, who is now defected to Reform. Now Paul Marshall is seeking to buy the Telegraph and add this outlet again to his vast media network via the Daily Mail, which itself seems to be semi-favourable to Reform, but also still platforms Boris. So who knows? Anyway, so now Nigel Farage has said, at the time, in 2023, he said in the Telegraph, he was deeply uncomfortable about the possibility that this Middle Eastern state might soon take over the Telegraph. He described the UAE as an absolute monarchy with an abysmal human rights record. Well, he's almost making me like it. And he said it seems fanciful that it would take jokes or questions in the spirit that runs through the British press. But then speaking to the Financial Times last week, and this was 1st of February, so 2 weeks ago, he said, I don't think we were very straight with the UAE over the Telegraph deal. Our Foreign Office is prone to lecturing them about how they should conduct their society. They just want a better relationship with the UK. Again, there's Nadim Zahawi, who was previously brokering the deal with Redbird. He was brokering it between Redbird and the Barclay family, which owned and controlled the Telegraph until 2023. There's another bidder in the Telegraph war. It's the owner of the New York Sun, who's David Affoon. So Paul Marshall's not the only bidder, but it looks likely that Marshall's going to procure the Telegraph at this rate, and Nigel Farage has been out in Dubai recently, speaking at GB News events, talking up GB News, talking up the UAE, reneging on his previous position the UAE shouldn't procure the Telegraph, and so it makes one wonder if he was out there with Layla Cunningham and Nadim Zahawi, Nick Candy, was he brokering good relations to ease the sale of the Telegraph to Paul Marshall, because then the Telegraph is going to be much more favourable to Reform, because at the moment it's almost like the Telegraph is producing such slop as to devalue itself by pissing off its readers to make itself more saleable, because all it keeps doing on is banging on about conscription for Ukraine and writing celebrity gossip pieces and articles aimed at like 100 middle-aged mums about why they should divorce their husband because they're having their second wind of life and want to go have sex with men half their age because they watch Bridget Jones 5 or whatever. Anyway, the Telegraph could be acquired and then contorted to be more Reform favourable. Not that I'd get published there, because yet again I'm banned from everything. So it makes no odds to me, but there you go. Now, it says here as well, in notes, in here, GB News is jointly owned by the Dubai-based investor, the Legatum Group, who own the Prosperity Institute, formerly known as the Legatum Institute, and the hedge fund entrepreneur Sir Paul Marshall, who in 2024 acquired The Spectator from Redbird for £100 million, and then appointed Michael Gove as the editor. What a poor decision that was. but I think Freddie Sayers is the one that deserves to be replaced most of all, for reasons we'll go through in a stream on migrant crime updates in Britain coming soon. So, this makes Farage's domestic rhetoric even more questionable, and we'll wrap up on this final section. There was this clip going around recently of Farage campaigning for the Gorton and Denton by-election, where he was talking about the sectarian divide between Gorton and Denton, because Denton, I think, is the almost homogenous English area, which is going to vote reform, and Gorton is the largely Muslim area that's set to vote Green at the moment. It's going to be a close race, but it looks like Matt Goodwin will, thankfully, win it, because I hope Matt becomes an MP. I think he's the best candidate. And he was asked, are you not worried about Muslim voters turning out against you? And Nigel Farage said something similar to what Majid Nawaz once said, that he expects lots of moderate Muslims to vote for him. And so you must wonder whether or not his liaising with the UAE, whether his measure to ban the Muslim Brotherhood, whether his accepting lots of money from Muslim donors is either influencing his rhetorical output, making him believe that actually he can win over a large share of the Muslim vote, or whether or not he's saying this to then attract more foreign investment, more domestic investment from Muslim donors. Anyway, let's take a listen to the clip.
We've got a Muslim woman who's going to stand for us for the Mayor of London contest against Sadiq Khan. So, no, there are plenty of members of the Muslim community who will vote for reform, support reform. The difference here, of course, is that for many, many years, the Muslim vote was viewed by Labour as being a block vote. They turned out and voted for Labour in their droves. That has changed a lot.
You've had to...
We've got a...
Okay, well, it isn't, because the Muslims are all going to vote for the Green Party. Despite Hannah What's-Her-Face, the fake plasterer and plumber, being a progressive, a woman, white, not Muslim, and middle class. So they're still going to vote for them anyway, and we're going to get some quick demographic breakdown soon. But the real reason for speaking in this way, for courting Muslim voters, accepting Muslim investment, I think was given away by a different clip from the same interview with the Daily Express. Let's take a listen.
Something like a third of the constituents in this constituency are Muslim.
Well, and we have very, very significant, very prominent Muslim supporters. Have a look at our list of donors. See that, right at the beginning of reform, when I came back as leader, there were some prominent Muslim business figures that backed the party. Have a look at the choice I've made to stand for Mayor of London against Sadiq Khan. She's a Muslim woman. So there's no issue with this at all. There's no issue with this at all. All there's an issue with, and what we have been prepared to speak out against, is Islamic extremism, which is why I have advocated that the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, I think, a very dangerous organisation, should be proscribed. So we have no problem with the religion at all, but we have a huge problem with extremism of any kind, wherever it comes from.
Finally.
So I want to be clear, I have a problem with the Muslim religion. I think it's false. I think it's inaccurate. I think it leads to more atrocities than pretty much any other. And so I am opposed to it, and I would just basically prescribe it to the extent that I am able, were I king tomorrow. But I'm not going to be. For all the people that encourage me to get into politics, Douglas Murray recently gave me a very good bit of advice, because he was generous enough with his time. He said to me that I have a philosopher's brain, and so did Enoch Powell. And look what happened to Enoch Powell when he pursued ideas to their endpoint. You either have to pick a lane. You either pursue the ideas and pressure politicians from the outside, or accept a degree of muzzling to be a part of a political party and be a team player and not pursue ideas to their logical endpoint, but get to be the one that pulls the lever of power to make incremental gains from the inside. And I think it's probably firm right now, ladies and gents, that I am someone who smashes Overton windows rather than sits within them, so don't expect me in Parliament ever, or anytime soon. And these kinds of concessions that Farage has made, here on Winston Marshall's show, in his candidate selection, in admitting that it's the donors that occupy, or at least attracting them, that occupy a lot of his time, attention, and agenda, is why I couldn't be a politician. But it does explain a lot, right? Reform wants to attract influential Muslim donors and of course establish a Jewish chapter, to shape its foreign policy to realign with the United States after the cozying up to the European Union and appeasement of the Palestinian lobby conducted by Keir Starmer and even conservative politicians. It wants to ban the Muslim Brotherhood to appease the UAE and not just create a encouraging investment climate so that wealthy Emiratis as well as British expats come back, but also to ease the passage of the Telegraph deal from Redbird IMI, possibly Paul Marshall of the Daily Mail, to fall into Paul Marshall's hands to become part of the broader media empire that is trying to get Reform elected and trying to make certain issues more palatable to talk about. So the Telegraph has published some great stuff on the grooming gangs, for example, from Charlie Peters and Sam Ashworth-Hayes. So it's not all nefarious. But this does mean concessions are made to the domestic and international Muslim community, which is why, for example, Nigel Farage has said that talking of banning halal and kosher non-stun or non-lethal stun slaughter would be far too divisive and a waste of political capital, even though I think it's necessary. So I hope all that's been informative. The final part of this I want to point out, though, is that this is a bad domestic electoral strategy. It might get you lots of money, and it might be that Reform are counting on people to show up for them anyway as the only alternative, and that they are so entrenched in the public psyche as the brick through the Overton window, the one option to rebel against the uniparty of Liberal Democrats, Labour and Conservatives, that they're just going to win over everyone's vote anyway. But I would caution them. I would caution them first about losing their base, because I don't think it's true that many Muslim voters are going to vote for Reform, but I do think it's true that many Reform voters don't like Islam. And this isn't just an affinity for Tommy Robinson. This is a specific dislike of Islam. So this was YouGov polling commissioned in July 2025 by a Muslim conference group, Pakistani Muslim conference group in Britain, who met up to discuss its findings. And overall, among Reform supporters, they believe that Christian immigrants have a positive net impact to the UK. They believe that Hindu immigrants have a negligible impact to the UK, but 87% of Reform UK voters, supporters, think Muslim immigrants have a negative impact in the UK. Definitively. Only 3% thought they had a positive impact. So 10 just didn't really bother. So, no, you're not going to win over more voters than you alienate by appeasing Islam. When Nigel Farage says by 2050, if we do not accommodate and if we alienate the whole of Islam, we will lose. In fact, I think you're going to lose more of your supporters. I think you're going to lose your white working class native British base in Essex, in the north of England, especially in the areas that border Muslim communities, like in Gorton and Denton, but that are afflicted by the grooming gang scandal, which today, at the Reform live event, they spoke about the need for a national statutory inquiry, and they said Sarah Pochin, who presumably will be Reform's shadow chancellor, justice secretary, she said that immediately her top priority is a national statutory inquiry and prosecutions regarding the grooming gangs. Rupert Lowe is currently doing the private inquiry that builds the evidence base to allow for private prosecutions at the very least, and everyone except David Bull, admittedly, has ignored this and said, David Bull said, more attention needs to be paid to it. Just because of a personal vendetta between Nigel Farage, Reform, and Rupert Lowe, because, they called the police on him and tried to ruin his life. Very unfair. Anyway, regarding other opinions, 93% of Reform voters say Islam is incompatible with British values. 70% of Reform voters say that Islam encourages Muslims to act violently. And 68% of Reform voters say Islam encourages anti-Semitism. So, sorry, but I don't really see how you're gonna... I don't see how you're gonna win existing Reform voters over to appeasing Islam while you're trying to attract more Muslim donors and more Muslim voters. In fact, I think the broader Muslim community, who, by the way, if they're second-generation university-educated young men, are much more radical than their first-generation parents, they're going to vote Green. And we can see today the following graphic made. But this is how young men would vote in a general election in 2029. And this has shocked people. But remember Adam Wren's law. Any alarming statistic about young people can be easily explained by unprecedented demographic change. 30% of young men would vote for the Greens, 21% for Labour, 17% for the Liberal Democrats, 12% for the Conservatives, that must be the gay population, and 12% for Reform. People are stunned that the Green vote has more than double the share of the Reform vote. And if only young men voted Greens, we would have a 354-seat Green Parliament, and Reform would only have 21 seats. Now, this can easily be explained, as I wrote, by the fact that Bangladeshi and Pakistani diaspora communities have almost double the share of their demographics under 24 than white Britons. It's why Mohammed is the #1 baby name now in England. Demographics clearly weight young men towards the let's take stuff from white people and give it to immigrants parties. Whereas the young men who are white are voting for Reform, and in many cases are even more radical than Reform. I think this is a fair share of my audience. Pretty much all my audience is under 30. 45% are from the UK, 45% are from the US, and a spattering of Commonwealth Anglosphere countries. And about 80% of them are men. So a large share of them are engaged in UK politics. They're young men, and they're kinds of men that Reform wants to win over. They're the kinds of men, if you're listening, chaps, who should be signing up as Reform candidates, even if you have to grit your teeth and endure all sorts of indignities to be in the party. Make sure you have no social media presence. But, as Will points out here, I believe he's a Pimlico Journal writer, the largest share of young men, they've been polling around 40%, with Reform have been polling around 40% for young men aged 16 to 20. And of course, Keir Starmer has floated lowering the voting age to age 16. So if he does that, then young white men, white British men, are going to be voting Reform. But because of the ethnic mosaic, the bottom-heavy demographic pyramid of diversity that Britain has become, most young men are not white British men. And so they're probably going to vote Green because they're the Islamo-Communist Party. But Reform should be cautious to not just alienate those young men, not just alienate their base on Islam, but also their broader sofa voters, their broader red wall, white working class, low propensity, first time in many cases voters, or at least the voters that turned out for Brexit and Boris and then have been disillusioned since. And this is starting to be reflected in the polls, a sort of slump in enthusiasm for Reform, with no real enthusiasm rising for the other parties. So if Britain were to vote at the start of 2026, you can see that manual labour jobs, 39% of them would vote for Reform. And this is reflective of the people that I've always grown up around. So people think I have quite a posh accent, and it's because I did a lot of quiet reading voice stuff in my head as a kid. So, playing a lot of like JRPGs and reading a lot of novels. So I have a strange enunciation of certain words, whereas most of my family are sort of Southeast London. You can occasionally hear a bit of a twang on certain words that I say, especially when I'm drunk. Get a bit rowdier. But I don't drink anymore, thanks to everyone's ears. But all my family are sort of traders, tradies, bricklayers, plumbers, etc. And they all have these natural inclinations, even if they are slightly disappointed by some of the stances that Reform have taken recently. And a lot of these people, including like a friend of mine who I went to school with him, he drives a white van, still good guy. Their only engagement with politics is hate Labour, taxes are too high, lot of immigrants around here at the moment, aren't there? Yeah, probably going to vote Reform, but I don't like the Muslim fellas. And so be careful not to estrange those people whose engagement with politics is basically vibes, perceptions, a dislike of high taxes and immigrants, and the Tories, especially across the Red Wall. And if Reform morphs into Tory Party 2.0 celebrating its defections, if it morphs into Nigel Farage is assimilating like a member of the Borg to the international business class, and here's this Muslim guy who's our second in command. Here's this Muslim guy who's a Tory defector. Here's this Muslim woman who's our mayor of London. You're going to start making those low propensity, vibes-based sofa voters, those social conservatives who like welfare state and dislike immigration, disillusioned. They're going to worry that reform has lost its anti-establishment credentials, and it's just not going to show up on voting day. So, by age, by the way, there's a by gender, it's obvious, right? Women are mainly voting for the Greens. Men are more likely to vote reform. But by age, you can see here, 37% are voting for the Greens, 18 to 24, and only 9% for reform. So you're not winning over young men. Well, you are winning over young white men, but you're not winning over young men. That diverse cohort that Farage keeps saying are the moderate Muslim vote that should be plentiful for reform. You're not winning them over in nearly the number that you think you are by being upwardly mobile and aspirational and talking about crypto and kind of flashy and having WWE aesthetics, as was reported the head office thinks recently. In fact, the largest demographic that are voting reform are 60 to 69 and 50 to 59. So people who are seeing the country left in a poor state to their kids and grandkids, that have property, that are approaching retirement, that are worried about the state of the country. And those people are worried, again, principally about economics and immigration. And if you have to sacrifice on immigration and culture to make gains on economics, I think those are the people who voted for Brexit, despite warnings it was going to be disastrous for the economy, just to get immigration under control, that you're going to start to see peter off and not move to another party, but not show out for you entirely. So that's going to eat into Reform's potential voter base and diminish their likelihood of getting an outright majority, which they absolutely need in order to win. It's broken down by age and gender, by the way, and the numbers of reform among young women are catastrophic. The numbers of reform among women aged over 50, pretty strong, actually. So if they were just voting, they would win a majority. But support among low propensity voters, though, is the most interesting part. You've seen a lot of lefty commentators beating up on the fact that reform have low education level voters. It doesn't mean they're not decent people. It means that they're usually tradies who are making a lot of money and probably have their own business with practical on-hand skills, rather than being members of the rootless professional managerial class that both Matt Goodwin and Christopher Lasch have mocked endlessly, who, yet again, if you have a degree, if you're the institutionalised Blairite midwit, you're still voting Labour for some unfathomable reason. But the most interesting part is political attention level. So the accusation will be, here, that reform voters are stupid, they don't pay attention to politics, and therefore they're getting all the low information voters. 35% of people who barely pay attention to politics are voting for reform. That's because the people who pay little attention to politics only pay attention at very prescient political moments. For example, the Peter Mandelson scandal, which basically says, oh, the Labour Party's run by the best friend of a nonce, so that doesn't look good for Labour. But also because they're sort of getting on with their lives and they vote based on their perception of whether or not they feel their country is in their possession. The state of their high streets, the amount of strangers milling about on street corners, opening dodgy vape and barber shops, the fact that there is a migrant hotel that's just opened down the road from their daughter's school, the fact that what they've seen on Facebook about their local area makes them irate. And so all of these things are superficial and perception-based, but they're legitimate. And so that means that if reform keeps making overtures to the Muslim community, what those voters will perceive that as is a siding of them against us. And so that's very dangerous territory for reform to be playing with, because their largest preponderance of voters is something that a Policy Exchange report in the aftermath of the 2024 election called the sofa voter. They are low propensity voters that you need to motivate to come out to the polls by giving them a genuine counter-establishment offering. This report says, on the face of it, the general election yielded one of the most decisive election results from the post-war period. Labour was returned with 411 seats and a majority of 174, something that by-elections are eating into. Labour's largest ever, barring that secured by Blair in 1997. The Conservative Party saw the largest fall in its vote share in history, with a 10.8% swing to Labour, losing 211 of its seats in Parliament. It couldn't have been a more unambiguous verdict on the record of the previous government, which ought not to forget the landslide under Boris Johnson just 5 years ago. But this doesn't mean that Starmer had a mandate handed to him by the British electorate. They note that Labour won with the lowest vote share by any victorious party in British history on a dismal turnout, just 60% of those eligible to vote. So that means 40% are up to be captured. That's the lowest figure in over 2 decades, 7% fall on 2019, no fewer than 4 million people who voted in 2019 stayed home in 2024. And that 4 million are going to be the people pissed off by voting for Brexit, voting for Boris, Brexit not being done, the Boris wave being inflicted upon us, and therefore being totally disillusioned with politics, and at the time, not believing that reform could actually break through. With not just 5 MPs, but any at all. They probably heard, insofar as they engage with politics, that voting reform is just a vote for Labour. Or they probably hadn't heard of reform beyond, oh yeah, Nigel Farage, I remember him from I'm a Celebrity. Now reform are just ubiquitous, right? There's signs everywhere. There's a kind of a feeling of inevitability about reform victory. And so you can't allow people to get complacent. You can't allow the sofa voters to stay home thinking reform are going to win anyway. And you also can't alienate the sofa voters with making overtures to foreign and domestic donors, minority interest groups, and the Muslim community that you think are going to vote for you and your Muslim candidates. I think it's disastrous. The message reform are sending right now is we don't have anything to offer the sofa voters that isn't that different from the existing parties, unlike what we were promising 2 years ago, which is the reason they were riding high in the polls for so long. They've now taken a sort of, in some polls, 10-point dip from their 30-something point lead. And I think that's because of a lack of enthusiasm. You're not seeing that enthusiasm carry over to the other established parties. I think this is people just dropping off polling entirely. You're not seeing a sudden rocket in the polls for Advance UK. You're not seeing loads of former Reform voters go over to the Lib Dems because their garden grew 3 sizes. What you're seeing is a disenthusiasm with the political process, and I think it's because people are worried that Reform, through their rhetorical output, through Farage's trips to Davos and Dubai, through their accumulating associations with the international business class, with Muslim donors, with someone like Peter Thiel, they're starting to see Reform morph into a uniparty with all the financial strings that come with it. And so what Reform need to do is, not just rhetorically, but substantively reinforce their anti-establishment bona fides and get some people in that don't have too much invested in not upsetting the apple cart of international finance. For example, Farage said earlier at the press conference today, we've got to get people to not work from home and back into work full-time. No, I think that's a bad idea, actually. I think most of the civil service who do work from home can have their jobs cut. But I think that actually flexible working arrangements, especially as productivity gains are made with AI, are going to be much better for a work-life balance, much better for people to be around their children, able to raise them, and it's going to contribute to, especially women, to be able to have the children they want and the time off they want to spend with those children. But the worry is, of course, that if commercial real estate investors have invested in Reform, moving away from the Conservatives, where previously the Conservatives had, I think it was about a quarter to a third of all of their donors investing in commercial property and residential property, they're investing in Reform, seeing it as the next party of government. So, of course, Reform want to promote commercial real estate by investing back in in-person working so that the market has another boom, because during and after COVID, commercial property is just dilapidated. They can't sell anything, and it's very hard to convert it into high-rise housing and flats. Very costly to do so. So, the worry is that Reform's priorities are being... some of the edges are being sanded off, and they're not necessarily doing 100% of what is best for the country, but rather what it takes to get into power and what benefits an international class of wealthy donors, regardless of whether their culture is compatible with that of the working class white British sofa voters who Reform risk abandoning in order to court that investment. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for enduring with me. I will now go to your super chats. I'm sorry for my dry mouth. I don't know what is up with me today, but I have lots to answer. Thank you all so much for being very generous. This is my only revenue stream at the moment. We are working on a thing after my previous advice at the end of the last live stream for you guys to pursue serious matters, be it medicine or law or policy, to scrub your social media accounts, to get clean cut, presentable, and to hide your power level and get into institutions for when the day comes when we take power, when we're going to be counting all of you. After my recommendation on that, we are hoping to build an institution that might give some of you some opportunities, so look forward to that. But for the time being, my only revenue stream to pay my mortgage and support my family is live streams and videos like this, is my Substack, etc. I'll be posting more regularly, including forthcoming my evidence submission to Rupert Lowe's rape gang inquiries, because I'm going to be talking during the inquiry about demographics, the impact of cousin marriage, clannish solidarity, Islam, etc. on the racial and religious aggravation of the gangs. So hopefully all of that is of benefit to you, and I will now answer some of your questions. Michael Stanley for $5 says, recommend some books for us. I read the book you referred to recently, Why Liberalism Failed. Well, I hope it was very useful to you. I'm currently reading Bernard Yack's Nationalism and the Moral Psychology of Community, and I'm going to be doing a video on philosophies of nationalism. So that was quite interesting. I would say, if you want a primer in non-normie political theory, or on McIntyre's book, The Total State, is a very good start. If you want to... Well, okay, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, I think it's one of the great psychological studies, not just of the 20th century, but of literature. And I would go for, if you want to understand how civilizations, particularly English civilization, formed, Alan Macfarlane's The Origins of English Individualism, and Larry Seedentop's Inventing the Individual, The Origins of Western Liberalism, because it reconfigures your default understanding of societies being formed rationally through social contracts, and rather moves your frame of reference to things being understood in terms of tribes, in terms of families, in terms of religious congregations, in terms of nations formed of peoples who have cultures handed down from father to son, from mother to daughter. It gets your brain thinking in a different way about your own civilization and about human civilization. Very useful. Someone said, for £5, if you think Invincible is bad, wait until you hear about what happened to The Boys show. I watched The Boys up until season 3, when the season ended with them applauding Homelander for lasering the heads off some protester that threw a bottle at his son. And then I was like, oh, they're doing a Trump thing. Okay, I'm just going to give up. I didn't watch the one where the attractive ginger woman was some sort of child predator or something. Season 2 was abysmal. Okay, the girls get it done bit. The breaking of rules about Stormfront's resilience to laser eyes, where she gets roasted and all her limbs get burned off, whereas Homelander indulged in her fetish by like lasering her breasts. It's stupid, totally stupid. Jack White, again, sending more dollar donations. Thank you very much, sir. Encouraging me to watch various bits of anime. I remain skeptical, but I will take it under advisement. If you want me to do more comic stuff, by the way, if I ever get time, I want to do some more, because the Batman video did very well. I've always wanted to do one on Watchmen. Harry and I did want to do a Comics Corner on Watchmen before I left Lotus Eaters. We just didn't get the time, and I've got extensive and controversial opinions on Watchmen, so it may be relevant to the channel. We might do it for a bit of fun, but again, I'm finding it difficult to find time to excuse fun stuff, given the severity of what we're facing. Jack, again, for $50. Thank you very much. On the Seth Rogen involvement, he voices one of the characters, Alan the Alien, and I think he does a decent job. It's like the English dub actor. The voice can be jarring at times, but fits the character well. Sure, I'm very skeptical of Seth Rogen's involvement, because he just seems like a total degenerate with a vengeance against Christianity and peaceful European societies. He just seems very odd man. Am I going to check out the remake of Fatal Frame 2 that comes out next month? Unfortunately not. I haven't played the first one or the second one, the original one. I also don't really get time to play many games at all. The last video game I played on my own, I played 20 minutes of the Tomb Raider remake over Christmas before I got motion sick. Before it was that, I think I played one round of Star Wars Battlefront about a year and a half ago. Otherwise, the last game I probably sat through and played was the Mass Effect Trilogy Remaster, because it's some of my favourite games of all time, and I may have to make an exception. You'll have to forgive me, chat, the Life is Strange reunion, because I've just seen the Instagram reel that says Chloe Price is a playable character. Let's go. The only other games I played recently, I played the Duck Detective games with my wife, which is sort of cute, wholesome, voice-acted, animal-themed detective games. My wife basically forces me to relax. Otherwise, I would just work forever and only read work-related stuff. I haven't broken into my comics library for months. It's a shame. Jack says, there have been good games that have come out. Lost Soul aside, if you like the Devil May Cry series, you'll like Lost Soul, Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth. Final Fantasy VII was the first game that I ever played in full. Played it for 2 years straight as a kid, and I haven't had a chance to break into the remake or Rebirth. I know they changed the story, so I'm skeptical, but I do want to play it at some point. But again, it's just a matter of time, and building things, politics is serious, have to pay a mortgage, hopefully starting our family this year. A lot of very difficult things have happened in the last 6 months. Still personal stuff going on at the moment that I don't want to get into, but potential rough weeks ahead. So it would be lovely when all the problems are fixed to be able to sit down and play video games, but my conscience can't excuse it at the moment. But you have been very generous with all your donations and suggestions, sir. I really appreciate it. He says, I listened to the Carl Catherine live stream on the Lotus Ears, and it seems to me Carl, when it comes to education and educating, he has tunnel vision. There were a few things Catherine said in that live stream that Carl cheered, led as a dyslexic yank. I had alarm bells going off in my head. Yeah, I disagree with the premise that it's either mass indiscriminate expulsions or we have to set up Michaela schools everywhere to educate the children of immigrants to cosplay as Brits. I said this in my Spectator debate, which still hasn't been released. Probably never will be, sadly. But hey, I'd at least like a copy to watch it back for myself, even though I'm not allowed to release it. It'd be great. But anyway, I said in my Spectator debate, what we do is we are sufficiently culturally muscular, and we prescribe certain cultural and religious practices to the extent where if someone commits a crime, they're deported, or we become a hostile environment for ways of life that will not reproduce our historic civilization, and so the people who want to live in that way will move on their own. For example, we ban halal and kosher. Now, again, there will be some Jews who object to that. I think they're going to be the ultra-Orthodox, Haredi, and Hasidic Jews who live in segregated communities who aren't as industrious as their Orthodox and secular counterparts, who will end up moving to Israel where their dietary requirements can be accommodated. Other Jews will usually eat the sort of 3D printed, cultured, kosher compliant meat exports, including pork and shellfish, because it's not technically pork and shellfish, that Israel is pioneering in, and so will stay in the country. But the large majority of Muslims won't eat halal, both non-stun and non-lethal stun slaughter food. And so if they want that food, they can go elsewhere. They can go to many Muslim countries, or some countries like Britain at the moment, who are indulging in these barbaric practices that we just don't need to put up with, and have their dietary requirements accommodated there. And that just means that actually we don't need to turn our school and our broader state into a Michaela school. Instead, the people we don't like and who don't like us will just leave, or be made to leave if they break the law. I think that's very sensible. I'm just going to skip over the game recommendations. Would you ever do live streams with Razorfist on your channel, correcting the record on Lincoln and McCarthy? I think he's correct on Senator Joe McCarthy. I think Razorfist is correct on Abraham Lincoln being a tyrant. He had his foibles. But I also don't think that makes Abraham Lincoln a bad guy, because I think that it's not whether or not you consolidate and use executive power that makes you a bad person. I think it's for which purpose. And the American Civil War is not something I'm emotionally wedded to, because even though I love America, I'm not American, so it's not something I grew up feeling a great affinity to, either north or south. But I'm not opposed to live streaming with Razorfist. I think his work on Michael Jackson is phenomenal. I'm a big Michael Jackson fan, always have been. I think he has some of the best content on that. So I don't know if Razorfist knows who I am. He probably thinks I'm a bootlicking state apologist, Britbong. But if he ever hears from this, forward my compliments to his work on I've watched it over the years, so potentially I've just got no point of contact with him. Other people, sorry, I'm just scrolling, asking Have you ever checked out the books Clinton, Cash, Partners in Power, and The Secret Life of Bill Clinton? I have not, but it may be one I have to add to my eBay wish list. Anyway, thank you, Jack, for all of those donations. You're very generous. Shaker Silver for $2. I remember you from the Lotus Eaters. Hello, sir. Seems Farage is keen to go Trump 2.0 before elected. Possibly, though you don't want to overplay your hand too much with publishing your executive orders ahead of time, because the civil service and the existing government can move against you. But if you're referring to Trump 2.0 in terms of his foreign policy and accommodating various sectarian client groups that give him lots of money, it's not an unfair comparison. Alistair, for £5. Hi Connor, consider a half-hour members-only section. Seems to work for many others. It's something I might be able to explore. I was speaking to the guys at Rumble about setting up simultaneous streaming. I just haven't worked out the tech yet. I've got a locals account that I haven't uploaded anything to. I'll try and figure something out. I'm not sure how I would do it. I don't know how I would do it with OBS. I'm doing all this myself, and I'm mildly technically illiterate, so you'll have to forgive me. If anyone can actually reach out and help out with all the tech for the stream and stuff, and you're knowledgeable about this sort of stuff, shoot me like a DM on X. Actually, the best way to get in touch with me, I've got like a members chat on Substack that was like $5 to get into. I only have it for a quality screening factor so that people just can't spam, but I also have message requests on, so if you can help, please do. Chikai, Nemesis by CA Bond should be on your shelf by default. It's on my eBay purchase list. Harry recommended it to me quite a while ago, but it's hard to get a copy of, actually. I think, I don't know if it wasn't Passage that printed it, it was Imperium, and I don't know if Imperium is still printing it, but anyway, I do want to read it at some point. Morgan for $1.99. Do you generally see any political solution? I'm not going to complain about the size of donations at all. I'm not a Twitch e-girl, but it does make me laugh that it's always the like £2 ones that ask the broadest possible questions. Do I see any political solution? I don't want to be discouraging to people because despair is a sin, as a friend who's converting to Catholicism recently reminded me. Pray for her. I don't think all of our problems are going to be fixed within one election. I think Reform are most likely to win the next party of government. I think Reform have the capacity to fix some problems. I think they have the capacity to actually surprise us with certain things by being better than we fear. And I also think they have the capacity to be distracted, waylaid, inhibited in ways that we're worried about. I think what Reform needs to do is succeed on the basics so that they don't sabotage the broader political project. And there is going to have to be the very real conversation about denaturalizing, deporting large numbers of people who have either been born in Britain or been granted citizenship. And I think the wedge in the door there will be the revelations coming out about the rape gangs from Rupert Lowe's inquiry and from the statutory inquiry that Reform are promising, which we hope they deliver on, because this is such a collective crime. Like, we judge people according to their actions, and the actions of pretty much everyone, not everyone, but pretty much everyone in the British Pakistani community, either participating in familial and county lines drug rape gangs, or knowing about it and covering it up, despite some of the women and children suffering abuse themselves at the hands of the same rapists. It's indefensible. We just can't live with these people. We can't live with people who rape children based on their race and religion, who drug them, who abduct them, who torture them, who seem to be trafficking them overseas as sex slaves and bringing their relatives over to attack, to abuse the same girls as an Eid celebration. Can't happen. And hopefully this is the conversation starter. Because demographics being destiny, if you have a large accumulation of the sons and daughters of the third world voting for the Green Party, there won't be a second Reform government, or whatever right-wing party rises to their right as a parallel. I went to the Advanced UK Policy Launch event, and I don't know if it's really of any interest to people in the chat, but well-intentioned effort, but underwhelming output. And I did provide some constructive criticism, but it wasn't received well by all of the party higher-ups in private. So anyone pinning their hopes on Advanced UK surpassing Reform, or even if they do surpass them magically in a poll, being credible enough to govern, I wouldn't pin your hopes on that at the moment. Yes, Morgan, it is better. Yes, I am a greedy bastard. And thank you for the donation, sir. I appreciate it. And the final one from Lantern of Liberty for £10 before I go and put my dinner in the oven. Keep up the good work. Greetings from the former colonies. Hey, you're our best invention. And when we need to replenish our depleted demographic stock with the expats of the Anglosphere, I look forward to you using the right of return policy that we implement to come over and make your home here in the land of Lord of the Rings. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you had a wonderful evening. I'm just going to check the live chat. I hope that was beneficial to you. More analysis coming soon. Keep an eye peeled for clips potentially coming out of Rupert Lowe's rape gang inquiry of what is discussed there. Hopefully my contributions are valuable. Until then, take care, God bless, and goodbye.